Assalamu alaikum students, welcome to this last lecture on this course. Alright, so dear students, let's see, today we are at the end of the semester and you see how fast, how quickly the time passes, you see. So time is very short. Similarly, our life is very short. You see that we started 6 months back and now we are, of course, about to start our last lecture of this semester. I'm sure you had a good experience in this course particularly and overall in this whole semester. I, of course, wish you very best luck for your career, right? Let's start this lecture to today, students. It's a very important one. Why it's important? Because we will try to review whatever we could do in this lecture, right? So you remember that what did we do in our very first lecture? I want you to go back and think, go take your notes out and see where did we start. I hope your notes are with you. I hope your register is with you. It's full? Okay, you can take out the older one that you had. I know you people work really hard, you see, and you have written a lot, and you people took lots of notes. All right, so that's why you have completed, in fact you have almost 4 or 5 the handbooks or the notebooks that you have. Anyway, so dear students, yes, we started with the very first day. All right, I gave my profile and I asked you for your profile. All right, you're right, fine. So let's come to the point, students. You see, if I go back to the very first lecture, we started with course contents, remember that, and I also gave you objectives of this course. So initially, in fact, we saw what is TEFL, right? Teaching of English as a foreign language. This is the course that we are working on, right? And we have worked for almost, yes, 31 lectures we had, and you have submitted your assignments as well, you have taken your quizzes as well, right? So yes, we have worked on that, and you have really learned a lot, and you have been active participants in this course, right? So we began with this TEFL. What is TEFL? Teaching of English as a foreign language. And here I need not to tell you again that teaching of English as a foreign language context and teaching of English as a second language, that's all, right? So you know the context is important. When you teach language in a context where it is not the language of communication, so we call it TEFL. And where you teach language in an environment where the language of communication is the target language, so and then we call it teaching of English as a second language. An example, you see, if in Pakistan we teach English because it is not the language of communication. And if you go to UK, or if you go to an environment where English is spoken, of course, that is language of communication, so then it will be, right, teaching of English as a second language. Clear? So TEFL, you know this acronym, very simple. So people say that of course general perception is that this TEFL refer to the world of teaching. Yes, because this acronym says that it goes with teaching of English as a foreign language, where what happens, the students are not the native speakers of English. Maybe in the first lecture you would not know it well, but today, after attending these 31 lectures, you are in position to find out that is it teaching of English as a foreign language or it is a teaching of English as a second language. So why it is a teaching of English as a foreign language? Because native speakers, right, you see, we teach English to the students and they are not the native speakers. And secondly, it is not that, you see, the environment, the context is not the language of communication. So this TEFL, in fact, refers to teaching of English, and you are pursuing this course. So this course has been designed especially so that people who want to be in this industry, people who want to teach English as a foreign language. So this course would train them. In fact, it's a training also, right, to help you out how to teach TEFL, right? And then we also saw the scope of the TEFL, my dear students. And remember I told you, yes, there is a huge scope of your subject, right? Institutions, education institutions, right, require you people starting from schools, colleges, universities, right? So in education industry there is demand for good, instructors, for good English language teachers, right? So again, demand for English language teachers is more than what English literature teaching. Is that clear? Then you can move on to other industries. Yes, there is a need. Fine, in multinationals, and of course other in oil companies. Yes, definitely people in fact need to speak this language, need to communicate in this language. So that's why there is scope of this language, scope of good language teachers also in the other industries is there, right? So you can join any training institute as a trainer on communication skills. So you can train employees particularly on English language skills, right? So different, you can join an NGO as well. So the point is that there is scope, fine, in different industries, right? You can be hired, provided you are a good, a refined, right, a polished English language teacher. So how would you, right, how would you prepare yourself, how can you refine yourself to be a good English language the teacher? So this course really helps you a lot. The TEFL that you had in this semester, and also in the next semester you will be having this course again. That would be advanced TEFL, we call it TEFL 2. So once you have this the 6 credit hours, so definitely you will be in a position to teach English as a foreign language, right, anywhere of course. And this is the local scope I talked about. Then abroad, right, in Middle East, still of course the colleges, universities in Saudi Arabia, in UAE, of course Sharjah, of course definitely everywhere there is a scope for good English language teachers. Again, you see, you can of course in Canada, yeah, there is a scope for English ESP teachers, English language teachers are there, because Canada is what, a diverse culture. Of course people come from all over the world and they need to improve their language, right? So that's what, of course, scope of language, scope of this subject is there. And I tell you again, my dear student, that you have opted for a right course, right? You have opted for a right degree, fine, and your course content is, in fact, your syllabus is as per the market demands. Whatever you are studying in this course, in this semester, yes, it's very relevant with the market. And if you do it well, you will in cash these skills, you will be a skilled person, and you can start your own venture. You can be an entrepreneur, right? You can start your own language center where you can teach languages, right? So in short, there is a scope for your course, but again the scope is for those who would do it well, right? So take keen interest in this course, particularly this particular course, that you need to know how to teach English as a foreign language. Then we started with methods, right? That of course to teach English as a foreign language we need some methods, in fact. And of course, how many methods we talked about? Yes, we talked about 8 methods, right? And we started with the oldest method, that was grammar translation method, right? And again, this method of course was designed to teach what to teach literature of the target language, or to be able to read literature of the target language. And then of course, then it is the oldest method, so to be able to read literature of what Greeks, for the classical literature, you could say. right? So that's why the method was designed, and we call it grammar translation method. And even the method itself, if you see, I've been telling you people that if you see these methods, so again there is a message in the method that, well, it's a grammar, the focus on the grammar, and then again translation. The grammar translation method is with the first method. And here, yes, how did in fact of course the teacher teach in fact the language? What happens here in this method? That the use of L1, right? क्या था उसमें कि आपकी मदर टंग की of course इस्तेमाल था और translation पे focus था, right? So this was the first method, that was the grammar translation. The method was there, that teaching English with the help of your mother tongue. Or if you see around, right, so generally in fact you will find that still in lots of institutions teachers are still using grammar translation method, where English is taught with the help of translation, with the help of L1, right? And then you see then of course, is it a success or not? That is to be in fact seen, right, to be debated on. But of course, once we'll move on, definitely we saw that method was not a success, because the purpose of language is communication. And of course, if the teachers teach this language with the help of the native language, so ultimately the learners in fact could not communicate in this language. And then again there was focus on the grammar and how the rules were taught deductively, right? So the teachers in fact gave some rules initially, and then the teacher expected students to follow those rules to clarify those grammatical concepts. So again, translation was there, right? And then the grammar was there, of course, for teaching, and the teaching target language with the help of mother tongue. So this was the first method, and we saw some flaws in this method. That, well, explicit grammar rules based teaching was there, that they see explicit, right, the rules were focused, and then memorization was there. You see, teacher in fact of course gave a list of words, and the students had to memorize those words. Then we see in fact the two important skills were ignored. The speaking and listening skills were not given value. Only reading and writing, these two skills were highlighted. And then of course we saw that, you see, pronunciation is ignored, right? There was no focus on pronunciation, because speaking and sub skills were ignored, because it was not that the speaking was ignored, it is not that listening was ignored, but also their sub skills were also ignored, right? And then there was the students' feeling were not dealt with. And then of course we see that focus on accuracy and correctness. These were some flaws. So considering these flaws, definitely we felt that if a method is a failure, if a method does not produce as per the expectation, because the learners were unable to communicate in the target language, so definitely we needed a method that would help the learner of foreign language to communicate in that language. So if the learner are unable to communicate in the target language, so you see that the purpose cannot be served. That's why we needed a method. And of course, what do we call it? Yes, method is direct method, of course. So now what is direct method? First method is GTM. I gave you there are 8 methods, right? So grammar, translation method is the first method. Direct method, even the name shows that you teach the target language in, right? How do we teach the foreign language? In that language, right? So this is what the direct method, where the teacher uses target language in the class, right? There's no space, there's no room for L1 in the class, right? And then what happens? Yes, students, teacher talk to the students, right? Students interact, like we see in the previous method, in the grammar translation method, that the interaction between students was almost negligible, was almost limited. Here we see that, well, there was, in fact, the students were given the chances to interact, right? So teaching target language with the help of the target language. So that was the direct method. So speak in the target language, listen in the target language, read target language, and write in the target language. And of course, we see that there was focus on all the 4 skills. Before that, you see in the grammar translation method, 2 skills were focused and 2 were ignored. And here we saw that in direct method, yes, the 4 skills were worked on. I mean, the student would be able to read, write, listen, and speak. Fine. And then, of course, interaction, right? Again, situational, of course, situational activities were there, so that student would be able to learn that language, right? Learn the target language in the target language. See, this was, of course, we call it direct method. So, all right. So, in fact, if you see that we also try to differentiate between grammar translation method and direct method. So we saw, if you see the review of that as well, that what are the differences between GTM and direct method. So the GTM encourages use of mother tongue. Direct method discourages it, right? And then, of course, grammar translation method, what considers translation an essential, fine, for L2 learning, whereas DM considers it as a barrier. We also saw that grammar translation method aims to teach the what? Literature of target language and improve knowledge of mother tongue. DM aims to teach communication in target language. Right? The DM says that, of course, language is for communication. GTM makes use of only literary passages. DM allows, yes, use of passages. I mean, could be history, geography, culture, and all that. I hope you understand. So these were some differences between GTM and direct method. So far, my dear student, we saw what is grammar translation method and what is direct method, and we also saw differences between GTM and direct method, right? In grammar translation method, yes, what mother tongue was there, use of L1 was there, direct method, no. Fine. In a grammar translation method, focus was on reading and writing. DM, fine, all 4 skills. I hope you understand. So move on. Then once we saw that, you see the direct method, and of course we call it the grammar translation method. So then audio-lingual method, in the wake of First World War, when of course America needed of course people who would have what? Native like proficiency. So there's a third method, we call it audio-lingual method. By lesson of, yes, we can find out that audio-lingual method in the wake of First World War, America needed people for the Second World War, and of course because for just propaganda, you could say, for spying. And then, I mean, America had to send people to defend the countries, and people would have native-like proficiency. So this method for that audio-lingual method, right? It's an oral-based method, right? And what happens in this method, my dear students, that you remember that, you see, drills were given so that the learner, right, would make their habits. Right? This method, in fact, makes habits of the students. So focus was on habit formation. How habit formation, I mean, of course, could have been achieved. How? By giving them drills. And we saw there were chain drills, there were repetition, right? There were a lot of activities, right? So that learner would not think of, thinking an expression quickly whenever, you see, of course, a situation emerges, the learner of language would be able to express his views, right? And we saw in audio-lingual method, my dear students, that, you see, lots of drills were there. And this ALM, of course, is based on behaviorism and structuralism. Of course, these were the 2 theories behind Because the behaviorism says that, well, the learn drills are important for the learning of a language, and then the learning by doing. And similarly, structuralists also that the pattern, of course, is also important. So that we see that in this AALM, what is it? That no room for native language or mother tongue, and language learning is a process, fine, of habit formation. That the learner, right, teacher should help learners make their habits. How? Yes, by repetitions, by drills, by activities. Is that clear? Students should learn to respond to both verbal and non-verbal stimuli. Whenever there is a question, they put response. So that method is what? Audio-lingual. Audio means, yes, listening, oral. And then lingual, relevant to your speech. This is what we call an audio-lingual method. And this method, in fact, was formed to have native-like proficiency in the language learners. How? Through a lot of activities and more practical activities, more drills, so that the learner would not think and respond quickly when there is a stimulus, and there would be reply. And how this can be achieved? Through continuous practice. All right. So once we saw that, you see, audio-lingual method highlights habit formation. Audio-lingual method says that language learning is a process of habit formation, right? And then people thought that how? Right, of course, that the point is that language is what? The language is a process in which what happens? You have to use this language in different situations. We have to be creative. Fine. You cannot have only a set number of the patterns that you would cram, or you would learn, you would memorize, and you would use. The point is that, yes, the language, of course, is, you see, language is a huge field. It's a diverse field. You see, so different situation, in fact, demands a different the pattern, a different expression to be used. So how come we see that the AALM method talks about that this is the habit formation, and you need to have these sentences, and you practice this, and you can learn the language. So this is what, of course, considering that, yes, because seeing that language is not something that you can encapsulate, or language is not name of the patterns that we can help our students memorize, and they would be using those. But the point is the language, yes, of course, every situation demands a different in fact, language item, language expression. So for that, another method is, of course, we call it silent way, right? So this method for the things, of course, thinking, in fact, that language is a process, is a thought process, right? That it is not that only the drills you would learn. Again, you have to think, and you of course, you respond. And different situations, definitely, your responses would be different for every new situation. Sometimes you're happy, sometimes you're angry, so definitely. So once you're happy, you would act accordingly. You are sad, so you're definitely sadness. That feeling expresses, of course, altogether a new point experience. So this silent way, in fact, of course, can be used for the elementary, intermediate, and advanced studies. So its principles are what? Far-reaching. You can say it not only affects education, but the way one perceives the life of living of a life. There are clearly implications for language teaching. Who gave this? Caleb Get-and-Go silent way. Here, simple. The name shows again. This is the third method we're talking about. First, talk about grammar translation method, then direct method, then ALM, audio-lingual method, and then silent way. You might be thinking why we don't call it silent way, because this, the Gallup himself didn't call it a method, right? So he called it silent way and approach also. Why? Because now this name again shows that, well, the teacher remains silent here. So if he remains silent, the question is how does he teach, right? So again, he teaches through his what non-verbal communication. he teaches in fact what? Through his expressions. So the teacher in this method, of course, that he speaks only when he has to. Otherwise, most of the time he remains silent. That's why, of course, the method, the approach is called silent way. So what this method says, that learning is a process which we initiate by ourselves, by mobilizing our what? Inner resources: perception, awareness, cognition, imagination, intuition, creativity. That I told you that, you see, you cannot rely on some set patterns. So learning is a process that, you see, that involves our inner resources, and the resources, they are perception, imagination, and all that. So fine, to meet challenge at hand. So this is in fact, of course, the method, this silent way. The goals were self-expression, so that student would be able to express themselves, right? And then again, the teacher is a technician or engineer, right? So he, of course, students become independent, like we see here. Initially, right, that the student, in fact, see, they of course, the teacher in fact points to a sound and the student reply, right? So students become independent, fine. And then characteristics, of course, sounds known to unknown, the way we move, in fact. Situational structure practice, right? And then interaction, feelings, of course, students' feelings were dealt positively, fine. And then we see that, of course, all four skills, right, we see. And then native language, almost. And then errors, we see that, of course, self-correction by students. I hope you understand. So this is what we say the silent way is there, a method in which teacher hardly speaks, and what the four languages are used, I mean four skills of a language are exploited, fine. So the approach is called silent way, and the goal of this process is, the goal of this method is that student would be able to express themselves well. All right. So after this silent way, another method we talked about, this is one, Suggestopedia. Very simple and very enjoyable a method where environment is very, very congenial for the students, right? You see the peripheral learning is there. There are charts, fine, and there are grammatical structures, and the sitting environment is excellent, right? And of course, this is what Suggestopedia says. And then there are two approaches, mean suggestion and de-suggestion, mean that your learner should be free of all psychological barriers. That is called de-suggestion, right? So once you remove all the barriers of this, what the learners are there, then they would be able to learn the language. And then this method particularly talks about that, yes, environment should be free, there should not be any stress on the students, and once they would be relaxed, they would learn better. So this is the point, that the learning in fact would be more impressive, would be more fruitful, would be more useful when the learner in fact removes all what psychological the barriers, and he tries to learn. So the teacher de-suggests the barriers and make learning fun, right? And the student must respect, yes, because there are lots of activities are there, lots of games are there, lots of in fact fun in fact activities were there. So for these activities, definitely the teacher's role is important, because teacher has to maneuver all these things. So that's why the teacher in fact deserves respect. And teacher also, he in fact acts as he in fact leads things, right? So his role is important in this method, where activities are there, more activities based method is there. And of course, it's called Suggestopedia, where the environment is also very what attractive, you could say, very a learned environment, in a way that there is peripheral learning is there. Now what is peripheral learning? We talk about that there are charts around, there are visuals around, and of course when the learner come, every day they find a new thing. This is what we call it Suggestopedia, and we discussed that's a very important method, right? And for adults it works, you see. And of course people who come from offices, they want to learn in this way, and because they want an environment there would not be any stress. And even we see in the, if I remember when we went to the class and the teacher says, well, you will be learning, there won't be any problem. See that? So this is the situation, this method, that is Suggestopedia. The grammar and vocabulary are taught superficially. It doesn't mean that we altogether remove grammar or vocabulary. Superficially, in fact, see, because teacher talked about grammar and vocabulary items, right? Briefly he talks about that. So that shows that, well, it doesn't mean that there's only fun. No, there is learning, but the learning, I mean, in a very free environment, a stress-free learning is there. So this method, Suggestopedia, suggests that learner should be given stress-free and excellent environment so that his learning would enhance. That's why this method, in fact, people, of course, still they say that it is one of the best methods for learning a foreign language, right? So the teachers, in fact, they try to, though I mean apparently it looks an expensive method, because you have to provide, in fact, in infrastructure to your institution where you want to have Suggestopedia. So errors are tolerated and corrected indirectly later. I hope you understand. So these is what we call it, Suggestopedia. Two concepts you must know, that what is suggestion and what is desuggestion, and then what is peripheral learning, right? So peripheral learning, in fact, students, you know that it works. Even in your classes you must have seen that there are some charts in the class, there are some visual aids in the class, and once you see all those things, you really learn. I hope you understand. All right. Okay, the next one is what we call it, this next method is CLL, Community Language Learning. Now what is this, by the way? What does it say? Community Language Learning. The name shows, in fact, yes, that of course, you learn language in a community, in fact. So what happens that is, once you are in a community, what do? You interact in the community, in fact, right? So more interaction is there, and of course in a community you work in groups. So once you work in groups, what happens? You help each other. You seek help and you give help, right? Because you are an important part of that community, right? If you want to go on with that community, you have to give and take. You have to be an active part of that community, and so is the case in this method, that is community language learning. And the teacher is counselor here, of course. He gives counseling. And that's why this CLL based on Charles, right? On Charles' theory, of course, Charles Curran's theory, right? The Curran's theory is there. The Curran theory talks about adult learning. Is that clear? So this, in fact, the method of foreign language teaching does what? It, of course, see, it helps students of foreign language find in groups and also in a community. So that's, of course, this CLL takes principles from the more general counseling learning approach developed by Charles A. Curran, right? And Curran studied adult learning for many years, and Curran is of the view that adults feel threatened by the change inherent in learning and by the fear that they will appear foolish. This is what the Curran feels, right? So that's why, of course, once the adults have this problem, so we need to create an environment so that they would not have such problems, right? So they should learn learn this language. They should learn this foreign language, putting all their fears aside. They should not have any fear. They should not be frightened. Fine. So because once they are part of a community, so every member of a community, in fact, helps others. So Curran believes that a language counselor could deal with studies problems well. So we see that the role here means the teacher is in fact what? Is a counselor. So the counselor is the one, in fact, the one who understands the problem of his client, and he helps him accordingly. And that's why we saw that in the CLL, the relation between, yes, the counselor and client relation. And you know it well, my dear student, that well, when once you deal with your client, what happens? You have to cater his needs. Because definitely, I mean, the client is correct. I mean, the client is there for you. And if you have to satisfy your client, you need to fulfill his demands, right? So that's why here we see that the student-teacher relation is the client-counselor relation. And the teacher is a counselor, and the counselor is the one who, whenever he feels that his client is struggling, he comes forward and he helps him out. He takes that his client out of the crises, right? So does the teacher do here, in this community language learning approach, this CLL, the method that talks about that language can be learned in a community, right? So, and of course, if you see it at the macro level, of course, once you join a community, my dear students, and you feel that in that community, you see everybody talks in that language, everybody speaks in the target language, and you will feel that community would, of course, if you are new to that community, and if you become part of that community, after some time you would feel that you would be learning that language. In fact, you will learn that the target language just by being in that community, because once you become a part of the community, then you have to live in that community, and for living in that community you have to interact with the community, you have to socialize with the community. So definitely with this socialization, with this interaction, with this one-on-one conversation, one-on-one interaction, yes, language learning becomes easier for you, right? So this one is, of course, we call it community language learning. Again, it's a method of foreign language teaching. Now the next method, of course, TPR, total physical response method. Remember that? Actions. Stand up, sit down, right? Jams the shirt, right? So this is very, again, active method, I call it. Why it's active? Because yes, there are lots of actions. And we discussed that actions speak louder than words, right? So that's why this method, of course, talks about that, well, through actions we will learn more. And again, we saw that initially, of course, the teacher comes and he speaks and he acts. So again, the focus on, for the first time, on listening skill. The method says that, of course, for speaking you have to have input, and of course that input is what? In the shape of what? In the form of listening skill, right? So that's what we see that, and once you see your teacher saying and acting, right, and you being a follower, you being learner of that language, you just see initially, and then the teacher brings 4 more students in front of the class, and they again perform the activities what the teacher says. So again, student and another chance to see that. So then, in fact, the whole class, in what a time comes that whole class, starts following those what directions, and we see that the focus was on imperative sentences. Then again, the grammar teaching through actions. And J. Masher says that, well, there was a question that, of course, these imperatives were simple, that these sentences were very simple, and of course the teacher taught these imperatives through actions. How about other grammatical points? So Asher is of the view, well, we can teach all grammatical points through this method, right? This is what he is of the view. So this TPR is, of course, a method Asher developed it. So again, the point is it's based on coordination, yes, of language and physical movement, right? There, of course, you say stand up, right? So and the students stand up, you move, right? And then you remember that, well, the teacher, what he does, that he changes the commands, right, in the mid of his actions. So in the mid of his directions, he changes the command, and to know that whether students have memorized those things or just they have understood it. And once he saw that the student would follow, in fact, him and follow the new direction, that showed that, well, the students have understood the command and they act accordingly. Is that clear? So that was, you see, that coordination between language, fine, and actions. So instructor gives commands of students in the target language, and the student respond with whole body actions. Is that clear? So they act. This method again is an example of the comprehension approach, because comprehension is a must. Student what? They comprehend, they listen, and then what? They respond or they act out. I hope you understand. So that is what this method talks about, that actions are important and there is a coordination between language and what? The actions. It's both a means of understanding message in the language being learned and a means of learning the structure of the language itself. Right? So the imperatives, teacher uses imperatives. Again, it's a grammatical sentence. Right? So again, structures are there. Right? So through actions, the teacher, in fact, taught them imperative sentences. And I told you that he is of the view that we can teach all other grammatical points through actions. And he gave example of past tense, and of course, other examples where we could teach, in fact, the grammar as well with actions. This is what we call it Dpr approach, that total physical response, that whole person. Teacher takes student as a whole person, in fact. So students, from this course, once we have seen that this teacher takes student as a whole person and they learn by performing, right? So the next method is CLT, communicative language teaching, right? So this method, of course, is definitely talks about the present as well. If you see around now, people speak for this method, and if you do a survey in good institutions, you will see that the CLT is being used, and of course in some institutions you might find this direct method. Fine, but still, of course, even in some areas you will still see grammar translation method is used. However, other methods talking about Suggestopedia or the CLL, right, or the silent way, yes, it varies. It depends on your instructors, that some teachers they find them useful and they make use of it. CLT is in fact a method, of course, that we have been talking about from the beginning, that you see language is a vehicle of communication. And this method, in fact, wants to improve communicative abilities of the learners through this communicative abilities. So activities were designed, and of course we see in the class lots of activities were there and students were busy in interacting, right? So they interacted more in the class, and once they interacted more in the class, and they in fact spoke on different situations, and in every activity we saw that there was communication. Sometimes there were information sharing. At times we saw the students were persuading others, and in one situation we saw that the student was acting as a stage secretary, and then we saw also there were some role plays on different situations. So what is it? That helping students to communicate, or making students communicate in the language, or improving their communicative ability, right? So how we achieve it? Through that communication. So communication is a means and also the end. Clear? Communication is the process and also the product, right? So communicative abilities, you try to develop communicative abilities so that student would be able to communicate in that language, right? So this was the approach, we call it CLT approach, communicative language teaching, in fact. What happens? Authentic language in the real context, because definitely the context is very important, because we have to speak in different contexts, in different situations. So that's why we see that the teacher, of course, uses authentic language from the real life, right? Because once you take material from the real life, so it helps you, in fact. Sports column, for example, we see from recent a newspaper, you can use that. Or ability to figure out someone's intention, mean communicative competence. What are your intentions? And we saw there are arguments between what the students also, right? And of course we see negotiations, right? So once you see these things, it tells you that, well, that of course there is focus on some abilities which were communicative abilities. And again, we saw that one function in different linguistic forms. Example, you see, the students, they give their responses, right? We had, in fact, a report with us. We have a news report with us. So over there, in fact, the news reporter predicts, right? That columnist predicts something, and then the teacher asks students about that. How do they predict? And we saw that student gave different responses. So again, focus was on functions, right? And at the end, again, they saw that the visual, they saw that, of course, material, they saw that report. So again, we see that, well, one function in different linguistic forms. And language use at a higher level means supra-sentential text or discourse level. And we saw that, of course, the importance of games as real communication. Task-based activities, right? Lots of tasks were given and students work on that. And opportunities for self-expression, right? Students were given chance to express, to speak, in fact, to express themselves. And then errors a neutral outcome of development of communication skills, considering that, yes, errors are part of the language if you make mistakes. So yes, it means that you are learning, in fact. So dear students, this is the approach, the communicative language, the teaching. In simple words, what it talks about, that the means is communicative abilities and the outcome is also communicative abilities. You need to, because you have to communicate in this language, you have to communicate in different situations. You have to communicate with different people. And for that you need different functions, of course, different linguistic items, in fact. So how can you do that? If you perform activities, if you practiced, right, for those situations in the class, right? If you have role plays, in fact, and of course, and then only then you can improve your communicative abilities. Otherwise, yes, your purpose may not be served as per your expectations. So that's why the CLT approach, yes, still it is considered as one of the best approaches for improving communicative abilities. And you see around, of course, now some good institutions, they have switched over to this communicative abilities and more focuses on communication. Alright, students, so these were the methods that we talked about in this course. I tell you again, 8 methods were there. So first one was grammar translation method, second was direct method, then audio lingual method, third one, then we talk about silent way, fourth, then we talked about, yes, Suggestopedia, right? Then we talk about CLL, right? And then we talk about what? CLT, communicative language teaching, right? These were the methods for foreign language teaching. Now again, why did we talk about these methods? It's important, the question, that of course even see that Larson says that it is not that you need to replace all these methods with your method of teaching foreign English if you are a practicing teacher. But what you can do is that once you know these methods, so these techniques or the principles or the activities that we see, how these activities can help you improve your teaching methodology, right? If you take CLL, or if you take talking about the direct method, or other methods which have been discussed here, how these methods can help you improve your language teaching, for example. And in these methods, if one of the methods improve, if you feel that, one of the methods, of course, we talked about, improves your, teaching of foreign English, in foreign language particularly, so then how? Of course, what are your feelings then, right? So that's why we need to know, if you want to teach English as a foreign language, so if you want to make your career in this field, so definitely these methods would be in fact, a guideline for you that how language can be taught. So once you can keep these I mean, different, in fact, elements of this Larson's book. You will keep in mind the classroom experience, you will keep in mind the principles, you will talk about the classroom activities. So definitely you would be able to start your career confidently, because you in fact know once you start that, well, what is teaching of English, and what are different skills that we teach, and how can we teach, and what are the available methods. And if you want to design one of your own methods, definitely these methods can be your, definitely a theoretical framework. Fine. If you want to add value to any of one of these the methods, so definitely these would help you in designing that. I hope you understand. So these were the methods foreign language teaching, and during this whole course I have been talking about this method. In every lecture I refer to these methods. I hope things are now on your fingertips, and please keep those 10 questions in mind. I call them TIQ, 10 important questions that include what? The goals of a teacher, right? You need to know after the end of every method, my dear students, know what are the goals of teacher, then the role of teacher, role of student, interaction in the class, characteristics of teaching learning, then areas of language focused, skills of language focused, how errors are dealt with, and how evaluation has been done. Right? So these 10 questions you must know. We call them TIQ, 10 important questions. At the end of every method, my dear students, you need to review and you need to answer all these questions. That what are the goals of teacher using grammar translation method, using direct method, using CLL, using CLT, and all that. Then what is the role of teacher and the student in all these methods? Then what is in fact the characteristics of teaching learning in all these methods, then interaction in all these methods, then of course which areas of language focus in these methods, right? How language is viewed in this method, how errors are dealt with, and how in fact evaluation is done. I hope you understand. So these TIQ, 10 important questions, are very, very important. I hope you understand. All right. Well, students, so after having had enough discussion on these methods, let's start now exploring skills. So our scheme was that first we would talk about these methods, and then we move on to skills, exploring skills. And here now we moved on from Larson's to another book, that is Practical English Language Teaching by David Noonan. So the Noonan starts, the first section talks about the 4 skills. Which skills? Receptive skills and productive skills. And we, of course, the point is that how did we discuss these things? Our perspective was teaching perspective. And for that, what did we do? Right? First of all, we defined what is listening skill, in fact. Right? That is it that, of course, the one who listens, right? And then we saw that what is the background to listening skill. Fine. And then we saw what are the principles of teaching listening skill, in fact. Is that clear? And what could be the activities in the class? Fine. And dear student, I tell you that of course in this book you will find lots of websites also that you can browse, of course, for more information. So first we talk about that listening is an important receptive skills, because listening, of course, improves your speaking. This is what is an input skill, right? It's an oral skills also, right? So good listeners are good speakers. So when you have to teach listening skill, you need to know that what is the background to listening and what different principles we need to keep in mind, in fact. And then of course when you listen for a specific information, right, or which approaches you can use. For example, we talked about bottom-up approach and top-down approach, in fact, right? So you listen for a specific information, right, or you listen for, in fact, for global view, in fact. I hope you understand. So we talk about these approaches, that bottom-up approach and top-down approach. Bottom-up approach is at micro level, when you want to see things, in fact, when you want to have details of the text. So we can have this bottom-up approach. An example is, so you remember that when you see a wall from the bottom, so you can have view, right? You can see the wall at micro level, but when you are standing at the wall and you see down, so then you have a global or the gist view, of course. So that is mean bottom-up approach, and top, of course, what do you call it? Top-down approach. Is that clear? So listening is an important skill, right? And of course, generally people feel that it is difficult to get a message of course in a second language or in foreign language. So what we can do, of course, you can suggest your students to listen as much as they can. This was the first skill that we talked about under the section of exploring skills. Then we move on to speaking, of course, because listening and speaking, in fact, right, because listening definitely their input, and then you start speaking, of course. So we saw that what is speaking, right, and then of course what are different situations when we have to speak, and then we saw that, well, how to improve speaking. In fact, people say that, well, it is not easy to communicate, to speak in another language, right? So we saw that what techniques can we use, right, to improve speaking skills of the students, different activities, and what principles we can use for improving this skill. And remember that, of course, speaking, there are skills, and the skills need practice. So the more you practice, the better you would be. So you can give maximum practice to your students in the class, right, and you incorporate the principle that we discuss. You can incorporate this techniques that we discussed. So those would help you in of course in helping your students improving their speaking skills, right? Then we move on to reading skill. Again, it's very important area, right? It is said that, of course, that the meaning, the message lies in the reader. And then while defining reading, we saw that the text and the reader's background and the fluency, of course, they together make this reading, and reading is comprehension, right? And we saw that good readers are good leaders. Fine. And then reading, of course, definitely there are different kinds of reading. You have a silent reading, you have loud reading, you have, of course, and then strategies for reading. Fine. When you talk about the readings, definitely you skim or you scan. And then which approach we can use for reading? You can have bottom-up approach or top-down approach you can use for the reading skills. And then how can you develop reading skills? Of course, we talk about that. See, of course, the most usable vocabulary, of course, that you can focus on, and whatever you teach, how you can teach that. Again, you need to know that why am I teaching these vocabulary items? What is the use of them? Right? And then we talk about how can you see that generally, of course, for the second language learners, you should have enough number of words, and that 1000 vocabulary is enough for some situations. And if you want to move on, then next 1000 words would be enough. So reading, in fact, skills really important. And you see, if you want to make your learners independent, you can help them. You can help them improve their reading, or you need to motivate the readers, in fact. So another point, of course, that, well, it depends on the learner also, if he wants to improve his speaking, listening, or other skills. Finally, move on to writing skills. Again, a very important productive skill. Like speaking and writing, they are productive skills. So we saw, in fact, that what is the background of writing skills. We had a detailed discussion on that, and then we discussed some principles of writing. How can we help our students improve their writing skills, and what different techniques can we use in the class, right? So that learner would really improve their writing skills. So these were the 4 skills, my dear students, we discussed under section exploring the skills. Now we move on to the last segment, that is what? Exploring language. So in this, my dear student, we'll talk about 4 areas. See what? First one, the sound system of language, right? Sound mean pronunciation, right? Again, it's very important feature of the language that you see the speakers of the language, of course, need to be good at pronunciation. And again, we saw that while defining pronunciation, you remember that we discussed that it depends on the hearer, in fact, how he perceives your sound, right? So we defined pronunciation, fine, with the perspective of the hearer, that how he perceives sounds. And then we saw, of course, that what is the difference between accent and dialect. And then again, as per the routine, we discussed the background to pronunciation, and we talked about 3 orientations, right? And the final one, of course, from 1982 onwards, where the target sounds were put into practice, right, through in communication. So those 3 patterns we talked about earlier, mean just listen and repeat, right? And then second orientation was audiolingual method, that of course what we did, we tried to analyze different sounds, right? The teacher gave different charts and students came to know that. So that was in fact teaching pronunciation in the class, right? And what principles we can use. We need to know intelligibility of, we need to consider that while teaching pronunciation, yes, that intelligibility of your students should not be compromised, right? So when they work on pronunciation, they should be intelligible to others, in fact. Similarly, of course, there are problems. In fact, effective consideration is also important when you in fact teach the pronunciation. Means that yes, there are problems in the society. Some people in fact reject this change in pronunciation. So for this particular purpose, the teacher needs to be efficient in that. Is that clear? So that's why what we call it, that how to teach pronunciation, some principles we discussed, right? And also we saw some techniques that we can use. We can bring videos. In fact, videos can help you. Like in reading, we discussed that, well, you can bring different books, but here and for improving pronunciation, you can refer students to the native speakers, to authentic material on that. Fine. So this was, my dear student, the first feature of the language that we talked about, improving pronunciation. So we had a detailed discussion on that. So please review that lecture, also read it. The next system that we talked about, vocabulary, very important feature of the language, right? And of course, most of you would say that to be proficient in language, yes, vocabulary is important. Yes, of course. But again, which vocabulary? The single words or the multi-word units or the core words, right? Or the word families or that, or all of this. You see? So what can we do? In fact, we saw that what is vocabulary, and then we saw the background to vocabulary, and then what are the principles behind, of course, principle of vocabulary teaching. And we talk about 4 strains. Remember that? Yes, that of course learning for meaning-based in input, reading and listening and reading. And then we talk about the language. Fine. Focus on language, mean sounds, vocabulary, and grammar. Then we talked about, of course, learning, meaning-based output, speaking and writing. And finally, we saw what development of your fluency, right? So these 4 strains are there. We talked about while discussing vocabulary. And overall, the role of the teacher is very important. We saw that the teacher needs to focus on the most usable vocabulary, and teacher needs to know the vocabulary that he wants to use in the class, or he wants to teach the students, that what is the use of this vocabulary, why is he using that, right? So that's the teacher, in fact, needs to know that what is corpus linguistics and which words are in and how, in fact, they can be taught in the class. So we discussed some techniques in the class, and also we saw some principles. You can review that lecture as well. Then finally, of course, we moved on to the grammar. Grammar again is a very important area of language, and we discussed what is prescriptive grammar and what is descriptive grammar. Fine. And we had a detailed discussion on that, how to teach grammar, what are the rules for teaching grammar, and we saw that you can integrate in inductive and deductive approaches. And we saw that while teaching grammars, what can we do? Yes, you can in fact focus on the relation between communication and the grammar forms, right? Do not teach grammar in isolation. So teach grammar in different situations so that learner would enjoy that. And then we saw different techniques that we can use in the class. And at the end also there are some dialogues are there where what happens, you see that the teachers, they use different methods to teach the grammar in fact, right? And again if you go back to total physical response method, James Asher says that well, through actions we can teach the grammar as well. So this was the last point that we talked about. You see, in the last lecture we finished discussing the grammar. So my dear students, this is the time to say what? Goodbye to all of you, my dear students. So thank you very much for being very, very patient listeners. You are all very good students. I pray to Allah for your bright success, for your career. So in this course, the point is that it's a very practical course, right? And this course would definitely help you in your career. And we will have another, of course, semester on this course, particularly teaching of English as a foreign language. I want you to in fact incorporate all these things that we covered in this semester, so that these things would be in fact a foundation for next semester. Next semester would be more practical, right, where we will be teaching in fact English practically, and you have micro teaching, we have how to make in fact a lesson plan and all that. But for that, these things in fact would definitely help you. You can see that these things are prereq for your next semester practical activity. So I say Allah Hafiz to all of you, with this hope that you will all qualify, you will all pass with distinction, with good marks, and you will be in the next semester. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.